The powers that be are ordained of God. Romans 13:1. God ordains those rulers, those administrations, those entities that exercise authority in human government. There are times when God gives the people exactly what they want, and that's not always a good thing. 1 Samuel 12, verse 13, Samuel is speaking to the nation. A king has been selected for the nation, and as Samuel speaks to the people about what they can expect, about this decision they've made, he gives a description of this king that's been appointed, saying to them, 1 Samuel 12:13, "Therefore, behold, the king whom you have chosen, whom you have desired." The king that they had was the people's choice. This was the king that they had wanted. Now, those that are familiar with the narrative, and we will investigate it somewhat, but those that are familiar with the narrative will remember that they desired a king and God selected the king. Let there be no doubt. God selected the exact king that they wanted. He gave them the one that, had there been a popular election, he would have gotten the vote. Oh, he wouldn't have gotten every vote. That's going to be shown in chapter 10, but he would have taken the popular vote. God gave them the very king that they wanted. They had made a choice. Now, 1 Samuel 12:17. In making this choice and this decision, God would describe their demand as great wickedness. And the people, in listening to what Samuel had to say in Samuel's message from God, would respond based on the evidence that had been supplied and the storm that would rage as evidence of what Samuel was saying. The people reply in 1 Samuel 12:19, "We've done this great evil." Thus, their behavior is recognized by God, by Samuel, and by the people as a bad decision. Yet they have been given a king, and God will promise them that if their king will follow God, then God will be with them. But ultimately, 1 Samuel 12:12, instead of having God rule over them, they had desired a king, just like the nations around them. "A king shall reign over us when the Lord your God was your king." They were trading theocracy for a monarchy. A people's choice monarchy, have no doubt, but a monarchy. There's a hint of democracy in their demands, and as such, it's worth considering what a democracy is. A democracy is a government system that is essentially has the power vested in the hands of the people, whether directly or through representatives. With the democracy, the ability to govern is derived from the consent of those who are governed. Now, as such, it has been said and rightly described by early American lawyer and statesman Daniel Webster, this government is the independent offspring of the popular will. The people brought it into existence, established it, and have hitherto supported it. Or we are a bit more familiar with Abraham Lincoln's words at the Gettysburg Address when he spoke of this government of the people, for the people, by the people. We understand the idea that a democracy is representative of the people who are governed by it. And whereas it has its strengths, it's also worth considering some other observations about the idea of democracy and the popular will of the people. H.L. Mencken would say that democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. There's some truth to that. Moreover, George Bernard Shaw observed, democracy is a device that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve. There's some truth there as well. One of the most quotable individuals of the last 100 years was named Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill observed that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. But he would also say democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. There's a lot of truth there as well. Theocracy is the greatest form of government. We do not live in a theocracy. We live in a democracy. Israel was wanting to put the people's choice in place of God's authority. Now what's interesting is, had they just looked back to their history during the days of a fellow named Abimelech, they would have seen the downfall of the people's choice kind of king, because that's what the judge Abimelech was, Judges chapters 9 and 10. And ultimately he was working to destroy those that he ruled, just like they were working to destroy him. Israel had become dissatisfied with God's rule here in the days of Samuel. Now Samuel will remind them, 1 Samuel 12, picking up at verse 7, that it was God that sent Moses and Aaron. It was God that had worked with them and delivered them through the judges. And it was God that had sent Samuel, the last of the judges. But they were dissatisfied with the rule that God was exercising. A quick venture over into 1 Kings 6 points out that when Solomon started building the temple, it was 480 years after they came out of Egypt. Now, that particular year is commonly accepted, readily recognized as being the year 967 BC, which means that 480 years earlier would have been 1447 BC, meaning they would have arrived in the land in the year 1407 BC, or very close there too. Now do a little bit more math. Solomon would have began reigning in 971, 4 years before he started building the temple. Solomon's father reigned 40 years, that's David. According to Acts 13, Saul would reign 40 years. That was Israel's first king. That would put Saul's reign beginning in 1051, which would be exactly 356 years after they entered into the land. For 356 years, God ruled them via the judges. However, they're dissatisfied with God's rule, and so they've asked for a king, according to 1 Kings 8, 1 through 5, like the nations around us. That's the popular vote. So, in considering those ideas, here's the people's choice. Give us a king. God would give them the king they wanted. It's called great wickedness. It's called great evil. And it is a trading of theocracy for a monarchy. They were warned what they could expect when they come to God, saying, give us a king like the nations around us. God would tell Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. But you give them the nature. You tell them the way that it will be when they have a king. And they're given warnings. The people's choice would come with the idea of the following hardships and difficulties. That king's going to take your sons and your daughters. Here's what it's going to cost for you to have a king. He's going to take your sons. He's going to make them his military. He's going to make them his servants. He's going to make them his people operating his chariots, his people operating his farms. He's going to take your daughters. And they're going to be doing all of the work that is so often associated with the feminine of the nation. Not only that, he's going to take the best of your crops. He's going to take the best of your cattle. He's going to take the best of everything that you have, the best of your produce and the best of your producers, your best servants. And he's going to use them to his will. And you are going to cry to God, 1 Samuel 8:18, but God will not listen. That's a synopsis of Samuel's words of the nation concerning this king they've chosen. Their reply, 1 Samuel 8:19, nay, but we will have a king over us. They've made the choice. God's leadership wasn't good enough. And in fact, they would go forward to say, we will have a king reign over us who will fight our battles for us. Please don't miss that part. Their desire for this particular ruler, the popular vote of the nation, is focused on someone that will fight these battles that God's been fighting. And the only time they've ever lost is when they abandon God. We want a king to fight our battles for us. They are not taking into consideration so many other aspects of leadership that are absolutely vital. They're short-sighted, sort of like nations that will just focus on the economy. Not that we ever see that happening. We want a king that will fight our battles for us. Okay? And so they got it. They're only focused on those physical concerns, those battles. They're short-sighted. Now, here's a question. In considering the people's choice king that they got, and the trend that so often follows the series of events that are contained in this history, when we make our choices, is God involved? When the people make the choice today, are we considering the kind of leadership God would have us to do? So often we emphasize that we are supposed to pray for government officials. The Apostle Paul, in writing to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 2, said, pray for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may live a quiet and peaceful life with all godliness and honesty. Does that mean we pray for kings and vote for devils? Or does that mean that we are to be endeavoring to identify and bring into authority those that would be reflective of the mindset that would be conducive to peace? Now, please understand, the people's choice was not inherently bad. And by that we mean this: God actually said that He would continue to be with them and work with them. If the king would follow Him, if the people would follow Him, God would be with them. He would not abandon them. 1 Samuel 12:14. Those things being said, there's a trend that can be identified. Not every aspect is always going to occur with every chosen leader. But when the people reject God's leadership and God's standards, and they decide we're going to go with the people's choice and the kind of leadership that we want, whether we're talking about in secular society or whether we're talking about in the church, when the people reject God's leadership for what they want, those leaders tend to start with promising potential. Saul did. Saul is the leader that is going to be selected. And when it comes to the appearance of Saul, he was first and foremost remarkable. 1 Samuel 8, Samuel has the discussion with the people about the kind of king that they can expect. God's going to give them exactly what they've sought. 1 Samuel 9 introduces the Bible student to Saul. And one of the key attributes of Saul, yes, he's descended from a mighty man of valor. His father is Kish. But Saul is one that is goodly. He's handsome. And he stands literally head and shoulders above the rest. From the shoulders and upward, he's higher than any. Just step back and think about it. How often is it that elected officials are actually physically ugly? Now, some of them get that way throughout their decades in office. We won't name names, but you step back and think about it. How often does it look like that the people that are being elected are using an outward physical appearance as part of their assets? Because people so often look on that which is outward. By the way, God would make that point in speaking with Samuel just a few years later when He sent Samuel to anoint the next king, David. 1 Samuel chapter 16, God would have to tell Samuel, I've not chosen him. Man looks on the outward appearance. God looks on the heart. The outward appearance was absolutely relevant, and God's giving them the king that has the outward appearance that they desire. He's head and shoulders above the rest. And yes, when the people saw this, at Saul being announced as the leader, 1 Samuel 10, 23 and 24, they see him as head and shoulders above the rest. Samuel tells the people, here's your king. And what do they say? 1 Samuel 10, 24, God save the king. He's ours. God be with him. Saul seemed remarkable, but he also seemed to have some other qualities. He seemed dutiful. The Bible student is introduced to Saul while he is away from home with a servant trying to find his father's donkeys. He's just serving. He's doing a work for his father. He is dutiful, carrying out a responsibility, but he's also thoughtful because after a time, he tells the servant, we need to go home before Dad starts worrying more about us than he does about the animals. He's thinking about his father's perspective. There is potential with this man named Saul. Real, viable potential. He's remarkable. Yes, he's dutiful. He's thoughtful, considering his father's perspective, and he's humble. He's so humble that when the servant with him says, hey, there's a seer, a prophet in the nearby town, let's go and visit with him. Saul's thoughtful enough to say, wait, we have no gift to give to the seer. But the servant says, I have this. We can give him this. And Saul is humble enough to accept help. By the way, the willingness to accept help is a key attribute of humility. The refusal to accept help is a key attribute of the opposite. Saul is willing to accept help from this servant. And not only is his humility manifested in his willingness to accept aid, but when he arrives and he meets Samuel, and Samuel tells him, you're going to be at a feast with me tomorrow, and he attends the feast, he's also told, 1 Samuel 9:20, on you is the desire of all Israel. Essentially, everything Israel desires, that's you. Saul's reaction, I'm the smallest. I'm from the smallest of the tribes, the smallest of the families. He saw himself as little. Keep that in mind. It's going to be relevant later. Moreover, once he is anointed, 1 Samuel 10:1, Samuel anoints Saul, and yes, he will send him on his way. Ultimately, Saul arrives home, and his uncle asks him, did you see the seer? Yes. What did he tell you? And Saul will relate to his uncle everything about the animals that Samuel had told him, but he says nothing about the kingdom, nothing about this anointing he's received. He's not publicizing himself. He doesn't say, Uncle, I've got big news. Guess what am I going to be? No. Not a word. He's not self-publicizing. He seems humble. He also seems capable, because when the events of 1 Samuel 11 begin to take place, he's going to be able to liberate the people of Jabesh Gilead, who have been attacked, surrounded by the Ammonites. They are in a position where they've said, we'll surrender. The Ammonite king Nahash says, if you surrender, I'm taking the right eye of every one of you. They say, well, then give us 7 days. They send for help. And when Saul hears the news, Saul gathers help with a rather drastic but at the same time provoking act of sending out the pieces of an ox, and says, God, do so to anyone else that doesn't come and help with Jabesh Gilead. The army of Israel arrives on the 7th day. 1 Samuel 11:11, they smite this invading army. They liberate the men of Jabesh Gilead. He's capable. When he was announced to the nation, back in chapter 10, and his father's household and then his name were called, he wasn't to be found. He was hiding among the stuff, 1 Samuel 10:22. He did not want the spotlight. And then when some saw him, they said, should we let him reign over us? But he held his peace. Again, more evidences of potential humility. And then after the events of chapter 11 and the defeat of the Ammonites, when they come to Gilgal to celebrate, there are those that will say, 1 Samuel 12 rather, where are those that despised Saul? Let's put them to death. What does he have to say? No. No one's going to die this day. God's wrought a great work in Israel. He seems merciful. You start looking at some of the attributes that are exhibited by this man at the very beginning, and he seems like a good fit. And initially, he was. To the point that he can be described as ideal. So ideal that the day that he was anointed and departed from Samuel, Samuel told him that the Spirit of the Lord will come on you. And God's going to give you a new heart. And indeed, there was something different about Saul from the time that he left that visit with Samuel, 1 Samuel 10 verse 9. The Spirit of the Lord comes on him. This is a miraculous sense because he will prophesy. God is helping Saul. God aided him with a great start. It was the Spirit of the Lord that came on Saul when he heard the news of Jabesh Gilead being under siege, and he garnered the people together to go fight. Yes, he has great leadership potential. They celebrate a victory, 1 Samuel 11:15. He's off to a great start. Yes, he starts with promising potential. Now remember, God has helped him with this great start, and God, through the prophet, will say in 1 Samuel 12, if you'll fear the Lord and follow him, God will be with you. He started with promising potential. But something frequently happens, and it did with Saul. It's the problem of fear. And Saul would indeed stumble over some flawed fears. In fact, the case can be made that even when he was hiding among the stuff, that's not exactly a positive reflection of humility. That is, for all intents and purposes, and for all the evidence that will follow, that seems to be an indication perhaps more of an in-kept pride than an actual humility. Because there are times when part of being overly introverted is just a fear of being embarrassed by messing up, by saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. And there's an absence of the humility that's required to overcome mistakes. That's the problem with Saul. He has a fear. There's a fear of attention that led him to hiding. There's also a fear of defeat. 1 Samuel 13. The Philistines are gathering to fight. Saul had been told by Samuel the day that he was anointed king. He said, there's going to be a time when you go down to Gilgal and you'll need to wait for me 7 days. And Saul understood that this occasion, which would be the third time that he would be at Gilgal after his anointing, but Saul understood that this was a time set by Samuel for this event. 1 Samuel 13:8, he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. After 7 days, on the seventh day, Samuel hasn't arrived yet. And so Saul makes a decision. 1 Samuel 13:9, he says, you bring the burnt offering to me. And he arranges it for it to be offered. Did he offer it by his own hand, or did he authorize other priests there to offer it? I don't know. What we do know is he did not follow the instructions given to Samuel by God and conveyed to Saul from Samuel. Instead, he took it upon himself to wait no longer. And the reason that he did so was because at the end of 1 Samuel 13:8, he saw that the people were scattered. Samuel hadn't come, and he's worried about losing even more and more of the Israelite army contingency that is at his disposal. He's worried about defeat. He's not worried about God's plan and God's timing. He's more worried about defeat. And this fear of defeat will lead to disobedience. There's an impatience here. But do not miss Samuel's reaction when he arrives on the scene. He comes to Saul, 1 Samuel 13:11, and he says, what have you done? He arrives as soon as the offering is finished being offered. What have you done? I saw the people were scattered from me. You didn't come, so the Philistines were gathering, given in verse 11. Therefore I forced myself. If you've got to force yourself to do something, then you know you shouldn't be doing it. Saul says, I forced myself and I offered it. Samuel's statement, you've done foolishly. And you've not kept the commandment of the Lord, verse 13, disobedience. Because of this disobedience, he's told the kingdom will not reside with your family. It's not going to stay with you. Pause. That doesn't mean he's completely rejected by God, heart, mind, body, and soul. That means that his reign is not going to become a dynasty. That's okay. He can still be a tool in God's hand. He can still move forward from mistake. Realize that there are repercussions from mistakes that can last the rest of our lives. By the way, that's something we must remember to teach even still today. But he can still serve God. However, this is not the only aspect of fear that is going to manifest in his life. There's the fear of enemies, which will lead to irrationality. Chapter 14, his son Jonathan engages the Philistines in a battle. He and his armor bearer slaughter some 20 Philistines all by themselves. There's a stir among the Philistine camp. They start buzzing like bees. The Israelites see it, and ultimately a battle will ensue. During this battle, Saul will say to the people, 1 Samuel 14:24, no one eat a thing. You're not allowed to take any sustenance. You are not allowed to eat until my enemies are smitten. Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged upon my enemies. There's a whole lot of I and me there. And because of it, his behavior is irrational. But there's something else to consider. He didn't have to be this desperate. Back up to verse 19. It came to pass while Saul talked to the priest that the noise that was in the host of the Philistines went on and increased. And Saul tells the priest, pause. What do we think the priest is doing? Making an offering? Petitioning to God? Using the ephod with the Urim and Thummim to obtain God's instruction? He says to the priest at the end of verse 19, withdraw thy hand. I'm tired of waiting. There's no more time. We're going to take action. Now, it's one thing to be a person of action. It's another thing to be a person of action that ignores instruction. And that will absolutely contribute to Saul engaging in this battle with an uncertainty that motivates his less than rational mind to make an ultimatum to the people that will weaken them. Jonathan never hears about the ultimatum. He's been too busy fighting. And there will be an occasion when he comes across some honey, he dips his sword in the honey and he takes a taste, and the people go, oh, you're not supposed to do that, because they know his father's haphazard rule. Jonathan will make the point that my eyes are lightened because I had something to eat. And if the rest of you could have eaten of the spoil of what you've already taken today, we could have had an even greater victory. The desire for a greater victory had actually weakened the army on Saul's part. He's irrational. And this irrationality will manifest even more down the road. For now, there's impatience. The problem wasn't Jonathan. The problem was Saul's irrational oath. And by the end of this chapter, he's willing to slay Jonathan because God's not answering. He claims it's Jonathan's fault instead of saying, I never should have made that oath. Fortunately, the people will refuse to allow Saul to slay his own son. Which brings us to chapter 15. Keep in mind, he, the leader, has just put himself in a situation where his irrationality led to the jeopardizing of his son's life, and the people having to use some common sense and say, this isn't going to happen. Jonathan wrought a great victory. Chapter 15. God gives instruction. You go and you smite the nation of the Amalekites. They attacked us 400 years ago when we were coming into the wilderness. You go and you battle them. Utterly destroy. Literally, they are set apart for God's destruction. What does Saul do? 1 Samuel 15, he goes, he fights, and he almost utterly destroys, except that he spares the king, Agag, and he spares the best of the livestock. He meets Samuel along the way. Samuel is told by God, verse 11, it repenteth me that I've set up Saul to be king. I lament Saul's rule. Why? Because Saul's leadership had abandoned God's instructions. God's instructions were clear. If it breathes, stop it. Utterly destroy. That was it. And it was a righteous, justified instruction, have no doubt. Yet, here's Saul coming back with King Agag and a whole lot of sheep and oxen. When Samuel comes to Saul, as he looks for him, God has lamented Saul's behavior, but Saul has celebrated it. Because according to verse 12, he came to Carmel, and behold, he set him up a place, literally a monument to victory. Look at me, what we have done. So when Samuel finally arrives where Saul is, verse 13, Saul says, blessed be thou of the Lord. I've done what God said. I performed the commandment of the Lord. Samuel's reaction is, what meaneth the bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen? I hear bah and I hear moo. Why do you have that? Saul's response, well, we brought them to offer sacrifice unto the Lord. God had said utterly destroy. The reason they were utterly to destroy, when God says utterly destroy, the Hebrew word is karam, and the idea is that it already belongs to God and He's given order of what to do with it. Saul has essentially robbed God's garbage heap in order to use that as an offering for God based on his claim. Instead of following the instructions, he pursued after his innovations. And then as he describes his behavior, notice what the motivation was. Picking up at verse 18, God sent you to utterly destroy. You've not done it. Saul's reaction, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, verse 20. I went the way which the Lord sent, but I brought Agag back, but it was the people that took of the spoil. You flew to the spoil. And the reason being, back up into verse 17, Samuel says, when you were little in your own sight, God made you head of the tribes of Israel. There was a time when you were little in your own sight. There was a time when you had a semblance of humility. There was a time when it wasn't all about you. But he's not little in his own sight anymore. In fact, there's something that he's trying to protect, and it's his position. Pause. Sidebar. Ronald Reagan observed that the key attribute of any bureaucracy is to maintain the bureaucracy. Any government position simply wants to maintain that government position. Any person posted in a government service, particularly an elected office, but oftentimes the appointed offices as well, are going to do everything that is needed to maintain the position. That was Reagan's observation. That's the case with Saul. He has a kingship that he does not want to release. And here he is with the people that earlier were the same populace that stopped him from slaughtering his son. And now he knows that he's not the ultimate leader because the people have more pull than he. And as they battle the Amalekites, the people decide, we are not going to slaughter all of the livestock. We're going to keep the best. Verse 21, he tells Samuel, the people took of the spoil, the sheep and the ox and the chief things that should have been utterly destroyed, but they did it to sacrifice to God. Does God have as great a delight in sacrifice and burnt offerings as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, to hearken than the fat of rams. It's better for you to heed what God has to say than to go about your own way. As Saul offered his excuse included the idea that it was the people that did it. To the point that, look at verse 24. Saul says to Samuel, I've sinned. You know what? I've done wrong. But here's why I did it. I've transgressed the commandment of the Lord in thy words because I feared the people. Ladies and gentlemen, he is not a leader. He's a follower. He feared the people. By the way, that is one of the greatest challenges of any democracy, is when those serving in government roles fear the people and so endeavor to mislead them so as to keep the people's backing, to keep the people's favor, but maintain personal position. Saul is guilty of that kind of behavior here. In order to maintain his kingship and his perceived authority, he yields it all to the people instead of yielding himself to God. And as such, the nation is going to be torn from him. Given to a neighbor that hears Samuel's words, that is better than thou, verse 28. Those words are vital to remember. The kingdom is going to be given to one that's better than Saul. The rest of his reign will be characterized by his reaction to this principle. It's taken from me and given to someone better than me. He couldn't stand the idea of someone better than him. He's head and shoulders above the rest. He's the one that's been appointed king. It's worth noting, and this applies not only in the realm of secular leadership, but in all realms of leadership. The fear of attention and the fear of authority prior to leading can often lead directly to addiction and fixation on attention and authority for those that are forced, compelled, or constrained into the role of leadership. That's a thought to keep in mind when we're considering 1 Peter 5:2, and Peter says that elders are to take oversight not by constraint but willingly. Because those that, for whatever reason, do not have the confidence to accept leadership willingly will likely be the ones that are actually going to be involved in abusing it. So, in considering Samuel, and in considering Saul, the people's choice leaders tend to start with promising potential, but they tend to stumble over their flawed fears. Saul did, And that fear of the majority, the fear of the people, led to his rebellion. And then, ultimately, they tend to succumb to selfish sentiments. A study was done a number of years ago looking at various companies, some manufacturers, some retail companies, banks, call centers. These companies all identified a feeling of being stuck. Their growth had stopped. They had plateaued. And in looking at their policies, their procedures, and their personnel, whether the companies were public or private, there was a common denominator that was found, and that was the fact that a fear, and more often than not, a fear of the loss of something, fear had led to policies and practices that were counterproductive to the company goal. More often than not, it was some sort of policy that had been put in place to protect authority or to protect a budget. And as a result, the companies were essentially shooting themselves in the foot. Saul has something that he wants to protect, and God has said it will not belong to him, but he's going to try to protect it anyway. It's not only his throne, it's the idea of his dynasty. He'll chastise his son Jonathan, saying that Jonathan's actions are going to result in him not having a throne, when it's actually Saul's actions that have done that. Saul would ultimately succumb to his selfish sentiments. What do we mean by that? Chapter 16, verse 13. David's anointed. Remember, God said through Samuel that God had sought a neighbor that was better than Saul. After David is anointed, 1 Samuel 17, Goliath. Saul wouldn't go out to fight him, but young David did, and conquered. 1 Samuel 18, beginning in verse 7. Here are the women celebrating David. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has 10,000s. Remember, it's still ringing in his ears. God's chosen someone better than you. And here are the women singing, David's 10 times better than Saul. Didn't sit well. From that day forward, he eyed David because he sees David as a threat to his position. Fear and jealousy. Have no doubt the fear and the jealousy existed before he ever heard David's name. That can be said because when God told Samuel to go and anoint the next king at the beginning of 1 Samuel 16, before we're ever introduced to David, Samuel's reaction is, but Saul will kill me. He knew that Saul was homicidal. He was dangerous. He knew that at this point, Saul was willing to take life to protect his throne instead of giving his life to serve his Lord. And it is the case that those that are apt to protect their position can be expected to be willing to go to almost any extreme to do so. With Saul, he was. He was homicidal. He was also unstable. Whereas the Spirit of God had come upon him when he was anointed and had come upon him at times in service that would supply inspiration and at times motivation, the Spirit of God departed from Saul. It's with David now, 1 Samuel 16, picking up at verse 13. And instead, an evil spirit from the Lord. Think of this in much the same way as God hardened Pharaoh's heart back in Exodus. Pharaoh's reaction to what God had said was negative. Saul's reaction to the news is negative as well, and now he's melancholy. Now he's depressed. Now he is actually erratic, and the word translated troubled connects to fear. He's paranoid. He's afraid he's going to lose something. And so he eyes everyone with suspicion, especially David. God was with David. That was evident. 1 Samuel 16:18 ends with the words, the Lord was with him. He had once been with Saul, but now things have changed. Saul is unstable. He's unstable because of his emotional reaction to his own decisions, the result of them. He's also detrimental. Consider his compromised actions. His compromised actions will result in him saying, hey, I'm going to let David marry my daughter. She'll be a stumbling block to him. Makes for a great father, doesn't it? And then later, 1 Samuel 18:25, he's willing to risk David and other soldiers' life in order to get David out of the picture, sending David to gather 100 foreskins of the Philistines as a dowry. And then 1 Samuel 18:29. The statement is made that Saul was yet the more afraid of David And Saul became David's enemy continually. David had been nothing but a friend. He'd been a psalmist that soothed Saul's very sentiments. But Saul only sees him as a threat. He's homicidal, he's unstable, he's detrimental, destroying his nation, and he's shameful. He would attempt to murder his own son, throwing a javelin at Jonathan. He had twice already thrown a javelin at David. He would attempt one more time, 1 Samuel 20:33. He would slaughter or authorize the slaughter of some 85 priests. His pursuit of David would weaken the defenses to the point that while in the mountains seeking David, the Philistines would invade the land, 1 Samuel 22:27. As a king, his focus on his throne has taken place of his focus on his nation. And when a leader is more focused on position than the people that are to be served, it is detrimental and destructive to all involved. Ultimately, Saul's life will end in a battle with the Philistines, with him taking his own life out of desperation. But consider the summary description of that very event as it appears in 1 Chronicles 10, beginning in verse 13. So Saul died for his transgression which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord which he kept not, also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit. He'd gone to that medium, and he inquired not of the Lord. He was too impatient to inquire of God. Therefore he slew him and turned the kingdom unto David the son of Jesse. And that's the king the people wanted. The point to make: the people's choice is short-sighted. The people's choice will often identify a major need, and this is top, and nothing else matters. And instead of looking for someone that has a proper mindset and a true humility, they look for someone that seems to have the physical features, that seems to have the prominent personality, that seems to stand head and shoulders above the rest. And hey, we're off to a good start. Yes, for about a year. Any lessons that can be learned in terms of the leaders that we try to find? Let's start on the personal level. Ladies, what kind of leader are you trying to find when you're looking for a husband? Congregations, what kind of leaders are we trying to find when we're looking for elders and deacons and preachers? Christians, what kind of leaders are we trying to find when we go to the polls? Are we short-sighted? Are we thinking like Israel did? Or are we looking more along the lines of the way God does, to the best of our ability? No, we cannot look on the hearts of the children of men as God can, but we can look far further down the line than the short-sighted scenarios and criteria that so often dominate our thinking. Saul was the king the people wanted. It's been said you can't always get what you want. What's frightening is sometimes we do, and it's the exact opposite of what was needed. It's interesting, 1 Samuel 12:13, Samuel says to the people, "Behold the king you've chosen." Fast forward 1,000 years. And it was a Gentile that said to the nation, "Behold your king," John 19. And they would say, "We have no king but Caesar." They rejoiced as a nation around a king that would almost lead the nation into destruction. But then they refused the king that came for the nation's salvation. So often we're so short-sighted we miss the great blessings right in front of us. Here's the question this afternoon. We know who our king is, and he's Christ. Have we surrendered to him? Have we submitted to the king that God sent for our good? Or are we behaving more like the nation of Israel that preferred to follow a king that looked really good, seemed to have some good qualities, but would run a nation into the ground? This afternoon, maybe you're not a child of God and you're ready to be baptized into Christ. Maybe you're a child of God and it's time to come home. Why not choose the king that God's chosen for you? If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, why not come forward while we stand and while we sing?